The sun cracked the edge of the world like a whip, bleeding red across a sky too dry for mercy. Dust hung thick in the morning light, clinging to every breath, every thought, every bone-deep memory that refused to die in the Arizona heat. The land was older than language, and it watched without pity. A girl moved through that dust, no more than 17, though her back was bent like someone twice her age. Her name was Clara, but no one spoke it aloud anymore. She wore a rough burlap dress torn at the hem and patched at the chest, and her feet were bare, bruised from years of walking on sun-baked stones. Around her waist hung a hemp rope tied like a leash, trailing behind her like a ghost. She wasn't plowing a field. She was the plow. Harnessed with rusted yoke straps that once belonged to a mule, Clara pulled through a stretch of dying cotton rows, her knees wobbling as she strained against dry earth. Behind her stood Jebediah Holt, the man who called himself her master, cracking a switch across her back whenever she slowed. "Faster, girl. You want a drink tonight, don't you?" She didn't answer. She hadn't spoken aloud in months, not because she couldn't, but because speech was a gift he hadn't earned. Besides, silence kept her alive. No protest meant fewer bruises. Fewer bruises meant less blood lost. Less blood meant she'd make it through another week. Jebediah spat on the dirt. "Useless little mongrel," he muttered. He didn't remember when he'd taken her in. Maybe 7, 8 years ago? She was just a child when her mother died on the trail westward, collapsing under a fever no one could name. Holt had offered to keep the girl fed and working. No one asked questions. Out here, everything not nailed down got claimed. The only claim Clara ever made was inside her own heart. Every evening, after the sun dropped behind the canyon rim and the wind cooled enough to think, she'd sneak to the edge of the horse pasture. Not to see Jebediah's horses, half lame, caged, half starved like her. No, beyond the fence, beyond the pale ridgeline, there ran something else. A black stallion. She'd seen it maybe a dozen times over the years, always at twilight. It would appear on a crest like a shadow given life, mane blowing wild, nostrils flared toward the sky. Not fenced, not branded. Wild in the truest sense. He never stayed long. Sometimes just a glimpse, then gone, swallowed by the desert. But every time Clara saw him, something inside her pulsed. Something that whispered, "You are not this. You are not his." This morning, though, there was no twilight magic. There was just heat. Endless, soul-boiling heat. The cotton rows stretched like a punishment across a dead horizon. Clara fell to one knee, gasping. Her fingers clawed at the brittle earth as Holt's boots thudded closer. "You done already?" He sneered. The switch snapped across her shoulder. She didn't cry out. She hadn't in years. The sky had started to shift. A sour wind rolled in, thick and uneasy. It carried a smell ozone, like something burning in the clouds. Clara looked up. A wall of black had begun to rise over the canyon edge. A monsoon, fast and violent. The kind that stripped paint off wagons and tore roofs from barns. Holt squinted at the sky. "Storm or not, that field needs work in. You finish it, or I'll finish you." He left her there, wheezing in the dirt. She didn't move for a long while. The wind picked up, slapping her hair across her eyes. She crawled to the edge of the field, using the yoke like a crutch, and stared out toward the hills. Lightning forked through the clouds, and for a moment, only a heartbeat, she saw him again. The black stallion. He stood perfectly still on a ridge above the pasture, framed by fire-colored sky, like a creature pulled from dream or legend. But this time, he didn't vanish. He watched her. Thunder cracked, and Clara flinched. The stallion reared up on its hind legs, front hooves pawing at the wind, silhouetted against the wrath of the sky. Then he dropped out of sight. Clara couldn't explain the thing that grew in her chest just then. It wasn't hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope made you get up when you should stay down. But it wasn't nothing either. Maybe it was memory. Or maybe it was the first breath of something trying to live again. By the time she limped back to the barn, the storm was in full fury. Sheets of rain hammered the tin roof. Wind screamed through the gaps in the wood like a banshee. Clara's hair stuck to her face, soaked and cold, her limbs trembling. The animals cried in panic. The mule kicked the stalls. One of the chickens had died from fright. She struggled to tie the barn doors shut, using all her weight to pull them. Close against the wind, Holt stumbled in from the yard, soaked, furious. "You didn't fasten the loft tarp?" he bellowed. "Rain's ruined the feed." She tried to explain, tried to point, but her voice caught in her throat. He raised his hand. She backed away. He didn't strike her this time. Instead, he grabbed the chain used for cattle gates and wound it around her waist, yanking it tight. "Climb into the hayloft. I'll deal with you when it clears." She obeyed without looking at him. In the loft, the straw was damp and sharp. Mice skittered through the shadows. He locked the trapdoor beneath her. Night came loud and angry. Thunder roared. Lightning lit the barn in fits and flashes. Clara curled against a beam, shivering. Then she saw it again. Through a narrow crack in the wooden slats, 2 eyes, reflecting lightning like polished stones, the stallion. He stood just beyond the fence, soaked but unshaken. The storm crashed around him, but he stood like a sentinel, unmoved, watching her. And then he stepped closer, right to the edge of the barn. Hooves sunk in mud, he turned his head not away, toward her. Clara pressed her hand against the crack. Her skin kissed the wood, the smallest gesture of longing. The horse huffed, breath steaming even in the rain. And then he was gone. The next morning, everything was still. Rainwater pooled in the low places. The air smelled cleaner, somehow. But the barn smelled of mold, damp, and decay. The chain was wet and stiff around her waist, but Clara had fingers like needles, sharp, patient, precise. She worked the end against an exposed nail until the link started to give. She didn't rush. Rushing got you noticed. Noticing got you hit. By midday, she was free. No one saw her slip past the edge of the field. Holt was busy repairing a broken fence post. The other workers brought in seasonally and treated not much better than her kept their eyes down. Clara walked, just walked. No rope around her waist, no switch at her back. Just her and the wind and the whisper of hoofbeats in her memory. She didn't know where she was going, just that she had to find where he'd gone, the ridge, the crest, the place where wild things dared to stand and be seen. The desert greeted her not as a friend, but not as an enemy either. It was what it was, merciless, but honest. By the time the sun hit its peak, Clara found herself at the dry riverbed. She followed hoofprints, deep ones, freshly pressed in. The mud, a single horse. No shoes, wild. She climbed the rocks with her hands. Cactus needles stuck to her dress. Thorns scratched her skin. But she didn't stop. Then she saw him. He stood in a clearing, drinking from a basin of rainwater caught in stone. His coat gleamed like ink under the sun. Muscles rippled under his hide. He raised his head slowly, sensing her. They stared at each other for a full minute. Clara stepped forward. The stallion didn't move. She took another step, and another. Then, behind her movement, a rustle, a warning hiss. She turned. A rattlesnake, coiled, ready. Before she could scream, the horse moved. In one explosive motion, it charged, hooves pounding against the sand, a blur of black and fury. The stallion leapt past her, smashing down on the snake before it struck. Clara dropped to her knees, breath gone. The snake's body writhed, then stilled. The stallion circled her once, then stopped. He bowed his head. She reached out, trembling. Her hand touched warm flesh, and the world, for a moment, went quiet. She didn't remember fainting, only waking. She was lying in a shallow pool of water, her face damp, her dress soaked. Her head rested against a mossy rock. The sun was lower now. The stallion was gone. But beside her lay a cloth pouch, a red piece of fabric tied at the top, marked with "with." A symbol, a horse, drawn in the old tribal style. She wasn't alone in the desert. Someone had been there, watching, helping, and far off, barely visible against the canyon rim, a dark silhouette stood on a ridge, tall, human, unmoving. Clara sat up, heart thudding. Someone was out there, and something inside her had just begun to wake. Clara woke to silence, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence before movement, like a held breath. The kind you felt in your bones more than heard. She blinked against the sun, her hair stuck to her face in damp strands. Her fingers tightened around the small cloth pouch with the horse symbol. Whoever had left it hadn't taken anything, just given. A gesture without demand. It unsettled her more than cruelty. Cruelty she understood. Kindness? That was unfamiliar terrain. She rose slowly, her limbs stiff from lying on stone, and scanned the horizon. No movement. Only wind dragging dust across the basin, and the distant whisper of wildness too far to reach. Still clutching the pouch, she began to walk, this time not with blind desperation, but with an instinct she didn't yet know how to name. Toward the ridge. Toward something. By mid-afternoon, her feet ached and the soles were blistered. But she pushed forward, her senses sharpened by fear and something deeper, anticipation. She didn't know if the stallion would come again. Didn't know if the shadowed figure from the canyon was real or a trick of light. What she did know, though, was this: she couldn't go back. A vulture circled overhead as she crested a slope littered with sun-bleached bones. She paused, panting, eyes sweeping the rocks. And then she saw it, fresh tracks, hooves, unshod. Deep in the sand. A single horse dot, and then came the sound. Faint, rhythmic. Breath. Not wind. She turned. The black stallion stood less than 20 feet away, half shrouded in shadow. He didn't snort or stamp, just watched. Ears flicked, head tilted. Clara didn't move. She let the silence build like a fragile bridge. Then she stepped forward. The stallion held his ground. She took another step and another. This time, she didn't reach out. Not yet. She just stood near him, chest rising and falling, close enough to feel his heat. He lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring. She saw the wound, just above the leg, crusted in dried blood. A bullet graze, probably from the night of the wagon. Chaos. Her breath caught. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a shadow shift in the rocks above. She spun. A man stood there, half camouflaged by the desert's rust-red cloak. He wore deer hide stitched with faded thread, his hair bound back in a strip of cloth, his eyes the color of cooled ash calm. Unreadable. She didn't know his name, but she would come to know him as Eben. They stared at each other across the air that smelled of horse sweat and heat. Clara didn't speak. He didn't approach. Instead, he reached into his pouch and tossed something gently down the slope. A bundle of dried herbs wrapped in bark string. Then he turned and vanished. Clara blinked. She picked up the bundle, smelled it: sage, yarrow, wild mint. Medicine. She looked at the stallion. He stood still as a monument. Clara didn't question it. She followed the tracks back to the basin, cleaned the wound, used the herbs as poultice, tied with part of her own dress torn into strips. The stallion flinched once, then was still. She sat beside him until dusk. When the stars broke through the sky, he finally lay down beside her, his massive frame sinking into the sand. She curled against his side and slept without dreaming. At sunrise, Clara rose with the first winds. The stallion was already standing, watching the eastern ridge. She followed his gaze. The figure was there again. Eben. Only now, he didn't vanish. He waited. She approached cautiously, not knowing what she'd say if she had the words. When she reached him, she noticed the worn bow across his back and a quiver with fewer arrows than she thought safe. A survivalist, tracker, maybe more. He looked at her, then at the stallion, then back to her. "You care for him," he said. Clara nodded. He nodded back, as if that answer satisfied something larger than either of them. Many try. Few are chosen. She didn't understand the weight of those words, not then. Eben gestured for her to follow. They walked side by side for hours. He led her through washes and brush, pausing to dig up roots or point to plants she'd once thought were weeds. He said little, only enough to guide. She watched his every movement, learning without asking. His silence was different from hers. Hers was born of trauma. His was discipline. Controlled. At sunset, they reached a shallow cave with smooth walls and soot-blackened ceilings. Old fires had burned here. Others had sheltered here. A forgotten place. But safe. That night, Eben shared food: smoked rabbit, a pouch of beans, and a tin of ground cornmeal. Clara ate slowly, unused to kindness that didn't ask something in return. She kept glancing at him, waiting for the change, the cruelty beneath the calm. But it never came. Instead, when the fire burned low, he placed another cloth beside her. A twin to the one she'd found near the pool. The same horse symbol. Tribal. Protective. "My mother made these for warriors," he said, voice like wind over stone. "She said they don't always wear armor. Sometimes, warriors just endure." Clara stared at the cloth, her fingers trembling. "I'm no warrior," she whispered, her voice rusty. Forgotten. Eben looked at her with the quiet gravity of mountains. "You lived." She didn't sleep much that night. Not because of fear, but because something had begun to shift, like sand finally slipping free from an old wound. In the days that followed, Eben taught her how to live in the desert, not just survive it. He showed her how to draw water from cactus, how to kill a rabbit clean, how to move with the land instead of against it. She spoke more, not often, but enough. He didn't ask about Holt. She didn't offer. But it lived between them anyway, the memory of blood and dust and chains. The stallion followed them, always at a distance. Never leashed, never commanded. Sometimes he vanished for hours, then returned, silent, solid, unshaken. One evening, Clara asked, "Why does he stay?" Eben was quiet for a long while. Then, "Because you didn't flinch when he charged." Clara thought back. The day of the snake. The day she had stood before death, and something else had stood between her and it. "He chose you," Eben said. "But why?" "Some creatures are born to break what binds." He saw it in you, even when you didn't. That night as they lay beneath stars so vast it hurt to look at them, Clara whispered to herself a lullaby she hadn't sung since her mother died. Her voice cracked on the notes, but she sang anyway. She didn't notice Eben listening. The next morning, the wind had shifted. Eben stood at the edge of camp, scanning the distance. "Someone's coming," he said. "Who?" "Not friend." They packed quickly. Clara saddled nothing. There were no reins. But the stallion allowed her to mount bareback. They rode hard into the western canyons, disappearing through brush and gnarled trees. The land grew wilder, more jagged. But Clara felt stronger here, more herself. After hours, they stopped to drink at a narrow stream. Eben crouched, eyes scanning tracks. He frowned. "Horses, 3, 2 with boots, 1 barefoot. Traffickers? Worse." She didn't ask. Instead, she noticed something strange: upstream cloth snagged in a bush. She climbed to retrieve it. Bloodstained, torn from a dress no child should ever wear. Her hands shook. "Girls," she said. Eben nodded grimly. "Taken south, likely to the pass near Bisbee." Clara turned to him. "We can stop them." Eben's expression darkened. "It's not our fight." "Yes, it is. You're not ready." "I've been ready since the first day I wasn't allowed to say no." He stared at her a long time. "If we go in, there's no going back. I'm already gone. That night, they camped high on the ridge, overlooking the valley below. In the moonlight, they saw a caravan of wagons, armed men, girls, locked in cages, lanterns flickering like the last breath of stolen lives. Eben handed Clara a flintlock pistol. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked to the stallion. He was waiting. The desert was silent, but something inside Clara had begun to scream, and this time she was ready to let it out. The desert at night had a pulse. It beat beneath the sand, in the brush, through the breath of creatures watching from behind thorns and stone. Clara crouched beside Eben on a jagged cliff face, her fingers curled around the wooden grip of the flintlock pistol. The metal felt too cold, too heavy. She'd never held a weapon before, not one meant for killing. She told herself it was for freedom, for the girls below, for the child she used to be. Far below them, the traffickers' camp stretched like a scar across the valley. 4 wagons, 6 men. 3 stood near the fire, laughing with their rifles slung over shoulders. 1 leaned against a post chewing tobacco, spitting into the dust. The other 2 patrolled lazily. None of them looked afraid. Why would they? They believed the land had already surrendered to them. Caged behind one of the wagons were the girls. 8 of them. Some too young to know what their fate meant. Others old enough to know and too broken to cry. Clara's jaw tightened. Rage curled in her gut like dry brush ready to burn. Eben handed her a pouch of black powder and a slingshot carved from antler. For distraction, he said, voice barely more than breath. Smoke bomb. Once it lands near the fire, count to 5. Then move. Clara nodded. He paused. You don't have to do this. I do. Eben looked at her, really looked at her, and nodded once, the way warriors did when silence said more than prayer. Clara slipped down the ridge, her body low, breath steady. The stallion moved behind her like smoke, hooves silent on sand. She reached the edge of the camp just as the last man turned to relieve himself behind a bush. With a flick of her wrist, she launched the pouch toward the fire. It landed in the dirt, rolled once, and hissed. 1, 2, 3, 4 boom. A plume of white smoke erupted, blinding and thick. Men cursed, shouting, stumbling into one another. Clara darted forward, pistol raised. She reached the first wagon and swung the door open. The girls inside recoiled. I'm here to get you out, Clara whispered. They didn't move. Come on. Still. Frozen, eyes wide. No faith left in the world. Then a small voice whispered, Are you an angel? No, Clara said. I'm just someone who finally said no. Behind her, gunfire cracked. Eben's arrows flew silent, deadly. 1 man screamed. Another fell into the fire. Chaos. One of the traffickers regained his footing, rifle aimed at Clara's back. She turned too late. The stallion came faster than light. He slammed into the man, hooves crushing the rifle. Clara barely blinked before. The stallion was gone again, vanishing into dust. She turned back to the girls. Now they moved. She led them out, one by one, guiding them into the brush. Eben met them halfway, blood on his arm, but eyes focused. He guided the group toward the western pass. Clara turned to go with them, then stopped. 1 wagon remained. Covered, locked. She ran to it, pistol raised. The lock was rusted. She smashed it with the butt of the gun. Inside, 1 girl, no older than 10. Chained to the floor, barely breathing. Clara climbed in. She pulled the child into her arms. I've got you. Gunfire burst behind her. She turned. Jebediah Holt stood at the edge of the firelight, shotgun raised, eyes wild. You never could stay in your place, he growled. The world narrowed to 1 heartbeat. Clara stepped out of the wagon, the girl in her arms. Let her go, Jebediah snarled. Clara's voice was low, steady. No. He cocked the gun. And then the stallion returned. He burst through the last wagon, splinters flying. His body collided with Jebediah's, knocking the weapon sideways. The shot went wild, tearing into the air. Clara placed the girl gently in the grass and turned, pistol raised. Jebediah scrambled, bleeding from the mouth. "You stupid little," she fired, not to kill. The bullet struck his leg, spinning him to the dirt. He screamed. She walked to him, her eyes hard as the desert. "You always said I was nothing," she said. He reached for the shotgun. She kicked it away. "Turns out I'm everything you're afraid of." The horses in the pen screamed, panicked. Clara moved to the gate and opened it wide. "Run." They bolted into the dark, hooves thundering like justice. Jebediah screamed again. One of the fleeing horses clipped his side, sending him sprawling into a burning crate. Clara didn't look back. She lifted the girl into her arms again and vanished into the brush. Eben met her at the edge of the canyon. His arm was bleeding heavily. The others had gone ahead, the trail marked with small stones. "You stayed," he said. "I had to." He nodded, sagging against a rock. Clara tore a strip from her dress and bound his wound as best she could. They sat together in the dark. The child curled beside them, the stars above like silent witnesses. "Why did he come?" Clara asked suddenly, glancing at the stallion, who now stood a few paces away, watching them. Eben looked toward the horse. "Some spirits don't rest until they've returned a debt. I never gave him anything. You gave him choice. He chose to help you, just like you chose to help her." The child stirred, reaching for Clara's hand. She took it gently. They stayed like that until dawn, when the sky began to pale, and the smoke from the destroyed camp rose like a final confession. When they finally stood, Clara turned to Eben. "We can't keep running. Not forever." "No," he agreed. "But we can keep them safe, long enough to make something new." Clara looked at the girl, and then up at the stallion. He lowered his head once, and together they began to walk. The sun crept slowly over the eastern rim of the canyon, dragging gold and fire across the bruised horizon. In the first light of morning, the desert looked quiet, too quiet for what it had just witnessed. The camp Clara and Eben had left behind was no longer a place. It was a shadow. Smoke drifted upward in thin ribbons from where crates had burned, where cruelty had finally met its reckoning. Somewhere in that ash, Holt's reign ended, not with a scream that echoed, but with silence that lingered. Clara walked beside Eben down a narrow mule path, the rescued girl still in her arms. The stallion paced just behind them, unhaltered and alert, pausing every so often to test the wind. The others, the girls from the wagons, had gone ahead. Under Eben's earlier instruction, guided by a sympathetic miner and his wife he had quietly befriended months before. A couple with no children of their own, willing to shield strangers in the name of decency. Clara had watched them vanish into the hills, clutching each other like drifting leaves finding soil. Eben's wound had reopened, a slow leak of red beneath the wrap. Clara stopped every hour to tighten the bandage, to give him sips from the last of their water skin. He said little, but she could see it in his posture, the weariness building like weight across his shoulders. Still he walked. As midday approached, the sun hot and cruel, they reached a hidden spring nestled between two dead oaks. Clara helped Eben lower himself against the stone, then gathered what herbs she could from the canyon floor. She crushed them between river rock, just as he had taught her. "You rest now," she whispered. Eben gave the smallest nod and closed his eyes. The girl, now awake and watching, moved to sit beside Clara. She hadn't spoken a word since being freed. Not one. Clara didn't force her. She knew the quiet was its own language. She had once spoken it too. Later, when Eben drifted into a shallow sleep, Clara stepped away toward the ridge where wind brushed through the yellow grass. The stallion followed but kept his distance. She gazed out across the valley. In the far distance, smoke still curled upward, just a whisper now. Not a scream. She let her hand brush the pouch around her neck, the cloth with the horse symbol. It had once meant survival. Now it meant memory, legacy. She could feel its thread pressing gently against her collarbone. A reminder she hadn't imagined all of this, hadn't dreamed her freedom. Why me? She whispered into the wind. The stallion exhaled softly, as if the question had been his too. Behind her, the little girl walked forward, bare feet silent on stone. She tugged on Clara's hand and pointed far beyond the ridge, where a few shapes flickered on the horizon, horses, wild ones. "Can we go there?" the girl asked, voice hoarse but clear. Clara blinked. It was the first thing she'd said. Clara knelt beside her, brushed a matted strand from the girl's forehead. "Someday," she said. "But for now, we build something here. Something safe." The girl nodded, and together they walked back to Eben. When he opened his eyes again, dusk had crept into the sky. The wound had clotted, the herbs holding for now. Clara helped him to his feet, and together they made camp on a flat patch beneath. A boulder overhang, no fire, just stars. That night, Eben spoke of his tribe. "We didn't vanish," he said softly. "They think we did, but we became the desert. The wind, the fire they cannot tame." Clara listened, the girl curled against her side. "Where will you go?" "Back to the edges," he said. "Where I can watch. Protect what's left. Protect those who choose to run. You won't stay?" Aban looked at her for a long moment. His eyes held no regret, only truth. "I wasn't made to stay, but you were." The next morning, he left without waking them. Clara found the horse symbol cloth folded beside her bedroll, and a small knife one she'd seen him use many times to prepare meals, to carve signs in the sand, to survive. It was his goodbye, no words. Just the passing of trust. The stallion remained. In the days that followed, Clara guided the girl whose name, she learned, was Elsie back toward a stretch of land Eben had once shown her. A quiet plateau near a stream, half surrounded by canyon walls. It was wild, untamed, but it held. Promise, it would do. She built with her hands, her bruised, calloused hands, took fallen logs and shaped them into shelter, dug a channel for water, collected stones for warmth. She hunted, she cooked. She taught Elsie how to listen to the wind, how to find silence in it. And the stallion stayed. He never let anyone ride him again. Not even Clara, but he remained near, always watching the fence line, always listening. Others came. The older girls, once recovered, returned in pairs, then threes. Word traveled, whispered between freight stops and watering holes, about a girl who had burned a trafficker's camp to the ground, who had broken chains and raised her own roof with no husband, no name, just fire in her soul. They came not for shelter alone, but for hope. Clara gave them both. The land grew. So did the house. More children. More women. No locks on the doors. Only open hands. The land fed them. They fed it in return. A new kind of family shaped by silence, sweat, and the sound of hooves on morning earth. Years passed, faces changed. But the wind always brought someone new. And Clara changed too. Her body grew stronger, her eyes sharper. Her silence became choice, not necessity. When she spoke now, people listened. Every year, on the day she had first followed hoofprints into the desert, she walked to the ridge where the smoke once rose. Sometimes she saw Aban's shape in the shadows, sometimes not. But she always saw the wild horses still running, still free. One evening, as the sun spilled gold across the plains, Clara stood at the fence line. Elsie, now nearly grown, braided her hair with string and beads, laughing with the others. Inside the house, bread baked over the fire, the smell of rosemary and corn filled the air. The stallion stood near, watching the hills. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the cloth pouch. Worn now, faded, but still whole. She whispered the lullaby her mother once sang, the same one that had lived in her bones even after she forgot the sound of her own voice. A hymn not of sorrow, but of returning. The wind carried it. The stallion raised his head. In the distance, a black figure crested the ridge. And just for a breath, Clara saw him. Eben, watching. She didn't wave, didn't call out. But she knew he'd seen her. She turned back to the house and left the gate open. Because some things were never meant to be caged. Not horses, not children, and not girls who once believed they were born to serve. Clara wasn't born to serve. She was born to run. And now, finally, she did, but not to escape. She ran to build, to protect, to become the fire. The wild would always return to her, because in the end, she had become part of it. And the wind, like the stallion, would always remember.